is in accordance with what Geoffrey Howe has Geoffrey Cox has said.
My uncle, Geoffrey Howe.
Geoffrey Cox has said. My apologies. So, could I invite you, perhaps, just to say where you disagree with Geoffrey Cox?
In his advice, I don't, apart from possibly on one aspect. I think it's extremely clear advice, and it deals directly with this issue of the good faith obligations, and of course you know that his conclusions and his advice. I think the one area where I would have reservations about it is his suggestion that if there is a deadlock, the fundamental problem is if there's a deadlock in negotiations, then we're stuck. And he concludes that even if negotiations break down and even if it lasts for a long time, we're still stuck. He then raises an argument, which is an interesting argument, which is that because Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union is directed to arrangements of withdrawal, if there's a deadlock and the backstop protocol persists indefinitely, there might be an argument that it, as it were, becomes ultra vires Article 50, because it turns into a long-term arrangement. Now, that's an interesting argument. I can't say it's necessarily wrong. I think there's a counter-argument, which is that Article 50, it's either intra vires or not at the time the treaty is concluded, and it's hard to see why, because circumstances evolve in a particular way, something, if it was intra vires at the time it was concluded, could become ultra vires just because of subsequent events. Right. So, but that's the sort of issue where I suspect, if you ask,
I'm totally lost. Ultra vires, what's that?
Beyond the powers.
Ultra vires.
Ultra vires, beyond powers.
Sorry, just infantry.
Okay, all right. Sorry. Let me explain. And it's a well-known concept, and particularly it's a concept of European Union law, that any legal act, any secondary legal act of the European Union's institutions must be within the powers conferred by the treaty, or by the particular part of the treaty we're talking about. And in this case, we're considering a withdrawal agreement, which on the European Union side would be concluded under the authority of Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. And that has certain limitations on its scope, in that it authorises an agreement on the arrangements for the withdrawal of the member state that is leaving. It doesn't extend to authorise a long-term post-leaving treaty, which is why we have this two-stage operation that we're going through. And the Attorney General's argument is that if the backstop arrangement turns into a long-term treaty as a result of deadlock, there could be an argument that it becomes beyond the powers of Article 50.
Yeah. Yes. Got that. Thank you. Ms. Van Dam.
I just want to comment on the issues raised. Maybe first as regards to Article 50, I agree that as a matter of EU law, the European Union can only act when there's a basis in the treaties to act. That's the concept of the legal basis, and that means that it cannot adopt any action that goes beyond the contours of Article 50 if that action is based on Article 50. I should note that the treaty itself, the protocol, I believe in its 4th paragraph, expressly states that also. So the parties agree that there is this limit as regards to what the legal basis of Article 50 can do. In terms of who would decide whether or not Article 50 is, as a matter of EU law, can offer any basis for a long-term solution, that would be for the Court of Justice of the European Union to decide that question of EU law, because that's a question of EU constitutional law. On the issue of material breach, I think the threshold under international law to say that there is a material breach is very high. There is case law to suggest that it must be shown that there's a deliberate and persistent violation of a provision that is essential to the agreement. Now, taking into account that this mechanism is intended by the parties, as stated in the agreement, to be temporary, and that there is continuous emphasis on the need to negotiate in good faith a future agreement that would replace the protocol, I think that obligation to negotiate could be considered as an essential provision of the treaty. But then one would have to establish that there is this deliberate and persistent violation. And the obligation here is not to conclude a treaty. It's an obligation to negotiate with the objective of concluding an agreement. So the mere fact that, for example, the European Union might disagree with some of the ideas of the United Kingdom, some of the proposals, would not be sufficient to say that there hasn't been compliance with that obligation to negotiate in good faith. So it's a particular threshold. I would also note that, in essence, what the United Kingdom would be alleging is that there's a violation of a provision of the treaty. And the treaty foresees for compulsory jurisdiction of the arbitration tribunal regarding any dispute between the parties on the interpretation and the application of the treaty. So that would also cover this provision regarding negotiations in the protocol. And so one could imagine that the European Union would then initiate kind of proceedings based on these jurisdictional clauses in the agreement. And there, at the end, what you may obtain as a remedy as a result of this procedure, this dispute settlement procedure, is a remedial action that may ultimately be taken after a particular process has been completed. That is a remedial action, and typically that is a suspension of certain provisions of the treaty. It does not foresee for the termination of the agreement. So there might also, we could discuss whether or not you could, as a party, unilaterally invoke material breach as a ground to terminate the agreement if that's not that there's certain tension with the compulsory jurisdiction of this dispute settlement system and the remedies for which the agreement provides.
Thank you. Can I just, it's probably not fair to ask you as lawyers, it's more of a general point really, but it has been suggested that the Northern Ireland Protocol has very little to do with ensuring that there is no hard border, which all parties are agreed there must not be, but it's more by way of being base camp for the future relationship, which of course was specifically excluded by the European Union from the outset until the withdrawal agreement was concluded. And one can begin to see in the terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol perhaps the shape and form that the future arrangement envisaged by the European Union might take. To what extent do you think, were this a withdrawal agreement to pass, it would be legitimate for the EU to use the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Customs Union arrangement specifically that it contains as the basis on which to build the future arrangement that it wants to see with the United Kingdom? Do you think it would have any sort of legal or procedural force?
I just have a first reaction. I think here, I believe it's the sixth protocol, the sixth recital in the preamble to the protocol might be relevant, because there the parties say that having regard to the Union and the United Kingdom's common objective of a close future relationship, which will establish ambitious customs arrangements that build on the single customs territory provided for in the protocol in full respect of their respective legal orders. So this presumes that the future relationship will be based on a single customs territory. And it seems to me that the political declaration doesn't seem to go as far, because it more speaks broadly about a free trade agreement. So I was a bit kind of surprised to see that particular recital in the protocol, because that, of course, does relate to a possible commitment that would build on this single customs territory created by the protocol. Yeah. Of course, it's a recital. It's not a binding obligation.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Actually, to follow on from Ms. Van Damme's point, the political declaration itself, in terms of the customs arrangements, I think the critical part of it is paragraph 23, which I'm sorry, in case not familiar immediately to everyone on the committee, but if I can just read out the paragraph, it's very short. That's in it's section B, tariffs. Paragraph 23, it says the economic partnership should ensure no tariffs, fees, charges or quantitative restrictions across all sectors, with ambitious customers' arrangements that, in line with the parties' objectives and principles above, build and improve on the single customs territory provided for in the withdrawal agreement, which obviates the needs for checks on rules of origin. Now, my view is that that paragraph in the political declaration is extremely important. Indeed, I'd argue it is the most important paragraph in the whole political declaration, and needs to be looked at with great care. And of course, it's linked to that recital about building on the arrangements in the protocol. And the status, the political declaration, of course, it's given a special legal status, although it's not binding as such. It's given a special legal status by Article 184 of the agreement, under which both parties agree to negotiate a treaty based upon it. And the big problem with it, which in fact directly relates to the Irish border problem, is that, as far as I can see, that is not compatible with a conventional free trade agreement, like the EU-Canada agreement or other free trade agreements, because all conventional free trade agreements necessarily involve rules of origin checks on goods that pass between the free trade members. And the reason for having those checks is that they're the necessary counterpart of the freedom of each free trade party partner to set its own tariffs in dealing with third countries. Because unlike a customs union where everyone has the same external tariffs, if you have a free trade area with different countries having differing external tariffs, you need to stop goods filtering in through the low tariff country and crossing the border and undermining the tariff policy of the other free trade partners. So that's why you have them, why you always have them, and why, for example, Article 24 of GATT defines a free trade area as being tariff-free on goods originating within the contracting parties, not goods that are flowing around in. So the problem with this is that it may be argued it actually rules out a conventional free trade agreement. This gets complicated because in the Chequers White Paper, there's a proposal for this hybrid customs arrangement, which the government may be contemplating that this reads onto, but that itself has numerous issues and problems, not least because even if it were to be workable, they seem to accept it can't be got ready until after the end of the transition period.
Yes, thank you.
I don't think I've really anything useful to add to that, so,
Cool.
except that as a UK drafter who is used to reading words and expecting to know what they mean, all I can say is that this clearly points the negotiations in a particular direction and gives some indication of where the two parties to it think they will go, but it can't possibly close all other routes.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Kate Howard.
Thank you. Welcome. Mr. Howe, you said in your memorandum, and it really did sound quite serious, where you say the lock-in nature of the protocol will gravely damage the UK's interest whether or not it actually comes into effect, since the existence of the protocol will compel the UK to submit to adverse terms in the future relationship agreement as the only way of preventing the protocol coming into force or escaping from it. I mean, that sounds quite serious to me.
Yes,
and I'm not a lawyer.
Well, you don't have to be a lawyer. In a sense, I mean, as a lawyer and as a litigation lawyer, one is always a negotiator. It's part of the job, but many other people negotiate. And the problem is, if you negotiate against a background where, if the negotiations break down, you are free to walk away, then you can hold out for at least your essential interests. If you negotiate against a background where, if you fail to reach an agreement in default, these terms in the protocol will automatically come into effect, that necessarily constrains your negotiating power. And it's then very hard to do better in your negotiations than the terms that you're locked into on the protocol, because why should the other side give you better terms? Because if you, unless you're able to offer them something else in return that's better for them. So I do think that
so we're going in with our hands tied behind our back.
That's right. So I mean, I think it's a very important point that you can argue about how likely or unlikely it is that the protocol will actually come into force, and if a long-term relationship is concluded before the end of 2020, it would not come into force. But I think you can't really argue that even if it doesn't come into force, it doesn't have a very, very severe constraining effect on the United Kingdom's negotiating position.
Okay, and do all three of you agree then that the only way to be absolutely certain that the backstop cannot be permanent, although I'm not sure how you would deal with that particular point, Mr. Howard, but would be to have a legal extra page added on to the withdrawal agreement that says legally that it can be got out of by the United Kingdom at a certain stage by simply saying we don't want to be in it anymore because we think we've satisfied the border arrangements.
What I said is that I think that you need something that can be relied on as a legal proposition to bring it to an end. It may be that there are ways of doing it that would be less satisfactory and wouldn't involve actually changing the agreement, but they then have to become politically acceptable, which is, I think, probably a bigger problem.
I think a few options have been put forward. One option that has been put forward is that one could have a kind of annex to the agreement or an interpretive declaration whereby maybe the conditions that are laid down in Article 20 are further clarified. Because there is Article 20, which is the review clause, is premised on the idea that the agreement would no longer be necessary, and I think that would be the position of the United Kingdom, and one could set out maybe in further detail what that would mean, what are the conditions under which either party could argue that it's no longer necessary, as then the entry point for the negotiations for which Article 20 foresees. The other option is, of course, has been discussed, is that you have a temporal kind of limitation of the validity of the agreement, of the protocol. There, of course, there's a certain tension, perhaps, with the essential objective also of the agreement, which is to avoid a hard border, because that, then the parties also accept that after the expiry of a certain period of time, you might go back to that hard border. So another option is that you have a type of sunset review clause, whereby you would have a temporal limitation on the validity of the agreement, so the agreement would expire after a certain amount of time, unless the parties agree to maintain that agreement. But then I think one should keep in mind that one has there's the option of termination, but there's also, under the agreement as it's currently drafted, I think it offers several means for the United Kingdom to put pressure on the European Union. I've already mentioned one method is to initiate dispute settlement proceedings, at the end of which it may be that an arbitration tribunal would then ultimately authorize the United Kingdom to adopt remedial measures.
That would take a very long time.
That would take quite a long time.
The EU might not exist by the time that would be sorted out.
I don't want to take a position on that, but the idea and the remedial measures, their core objective is to induce the other party to comply. Another option is, and that's I think Article 18 of the protocol sets out an option of imposing safeguards, and it's quite widely formulated, where actually it enables either party to the agreement to, in certain conditions, adopt safeguards, which are again remedial measures, and without having to go to dispute settlement. So that could be adopted much more quickly, and then one would have to see if the European Union, let's say, disagrees and says, well, there's a violation of Article 18. But it seems to me that there are certain mechanisms under the agreement that would enable either party to put pressure on the other party to engage in those negotiations with the objective of coming to an agreement that would replace this protocol.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, on that last point, on Article 18, I mean, the threshold for the adoption of safeguard measures in Article 18 of the Protocol is pretty high. It's if application of this protocol leads to serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties liable to persist or to diversion of trade, the Union or the United Kingdom may unilaterally take appropriate measures. And I can't see that that is really a solution to some disagreement over the nature of border arrangements. The purpose of that, it seems to me, is more to do with the level playing field, so-called level playing field provisions of the protocol, and giving, in fact, both parties, but particularly the European Union, a basis for taking action were we to do something, say, in the field of state aids that they disagreed with. They would entitle them to take action like putting countervailing duties on products from a company to whom, in Britain, to whom state aid had been given. So I leave that aside. I can't see any way in which the lock-in problem can be solved other than by something that amends the treaty at the same legal level as the treaty. I mean, it doesn't matter in a way whether it's a separate document that amends it or whether it's an amendment to the text as it stands. That's a matter of mechanics rather than substance. And the most straightforward way would be a simple time-limited right to leave. That would also affect beneficially the negotiating dynamic that I referred to, because if we knew we could get out of it after a period of time, that would give us a stronger hand in the preceding negotiations. I mean, there is an alternative, which is to have much clearer criteria for when the protocol would cease to apply, much more clear and objective criteria, because at the moment the review clause, in fact, the criteria are those in Article, they're very broad criteria which are to do with just supporting the objectives of the Belfast Agreement. So it would be impossible to say, if the European Union objects to revised proposed border arrangements, it seems to me it would be almost impossible, provided they put forward some sort of coherent political justification linked to the Belfast Agreement, to say they were acting in bad faith in failing to agree to us being able to substitute those arrangements. Now, you could substitute a much clearer clause giving much more objective criteria, and that would be possible, but very unsatisfactory, because we could end up in an international tribunal for years and years arguing about whether those criteria have been met or not.
I was going to just ask you, Sir Stephen, as well. I mean, does it surprise you that our negotiators, and particularly our legal people who have been involved in the negotiation, have kind of got us into this position?
No, but I don't really know enough about how they got into it. I mean, I think I think it's important, though, not to always look at this as a legal problem which may have a legal solution. I mean, I think we've discussed various ways in which there might be a legal solution to this, but that doesn't address the real problem. The problem isn't that there isn't an exit from the backstop. The problem is that there is a lack of trust on each side that is triggered by the backstop, and finding a solution to the problem of lack of trust is more difficult, perhaps, than finding a solution to the backstop. On the one hand, people fear that it may be an attempt to lock us into something. And that fear is generated partly by the fact that we have the capacity to leave the European Union at the moment with 2 years' notice. And why would it be any worse to have the ability to exit whatever arrangement comes next with a similar period, or perhaps, as it's meant to be temporary, a shorter period of notice? And on the other, there is, I think, at least purportedly, some anxiety about the Good Friday Agreement, to which, on the UK side, we would say, well, we're bound by the Good Friday Agreement. Why should we need to repeat it in further requirements? Obviously, you have to find a way of implementing it. But in order to ensure that the UK respects the Good Friday or the Belfast Agreement, you don't need anything because the UK will. You might need something if you find a way of exiting that would give reassurance to the other side about what happens to the Good Friday Agreement. That might resolve that problem of trust. The problem of trust on our side might be resolved by providing more reassurance about a way out. That's how it seems to us. But how far you go legally to do that is not determined. It's not a legal question.
Well, I'm sure my colleagues will get on to perhaps other options which might be simpler, or just simply leaving on WTO terms. But Chairman, thank you.
Yes, that takes me nicely on to my question, which is leaving on WTO terms. There's been a lot of political debate about what would happen if the withdrawal agreement, either in its current or in a modified state, wasn't agreed. And there are some in this place who think that we'd automatically go into a no-deal Brexit under WTO rules. And many people sort of said, well, this is the way the whole world trades, this wouldn't be a problem. But then others are saying this could be really, really difficult. I mean, just looking at the WTO tariffs, for example, on beef, which makes up 40% of all the Irish Republic's food and drink exports, valued at 2.5 billion, of which 50% goes to the UK, there would be a €3 per kilo tariff plus 12.8% of value, which is around about 65% tariff across the carcass. Would, in the event of a no-deal scenario, that be a situation that would have to be applied, or would there be some flexibility in terms of that tariff? I don't know whether Ms Van Dam would be the best person to start off.
Well, just focusing on tariffs, the United Kingdom can will now have its own schedule under the WTO, which means there's maximum bindings as regards to the level of the tariff it may impose. It's certainly true that leaves the fact that you have a schedule and those maximum commitments does not mean that you may not impose a lower tariff or impose a zero tariff. In fact, many WTO members do that for many types of products, despite the fact that they have these maximum commitments in the WTO, and that's the so-called applied rate. And the United Kingdom could, if it wishes to do so, could reduce the tariff to a level that is much lower than its binding commitment under WTO law. For trade, we're dealing with trade going in the two directions, and there's two sides of this border.
Well, lamb exports from the United Kingdom are very important, and that
exactly
potentially would have a similar level of tariff
and
for exports to France.
Yeah, and from for trade going from the United Kingdom to the European Union, including this to Ireland, Ireland would need to apply the Common Customs Code. So the European Union imposes obligations on the members to enforce customs legislation and the Common Customs Code. So while the United Kingdom might decide to reduce its tariffs for certain goods, there is no guarantee that without an agreement that the European Union would take the same decision. So the applied rates that one sees now in the Common Customs Code may continue to be the same if there is no deal.
So the EU would impose the WTO level of tariffs?
No, it would apply the applied rate. It's now the MFN rate, the non-preferential rate that it applies to imports from all other third countries with which it has not signed, for example, a free trade agreement, and so there's no preferential tariff. MFN rates would apply.
So in that situation, the UK would have to take a view whether it would reciprocate with similar levels of tariff, or would set lower or even zero tariffs in that situation.
Yes, that's a decision for the United Kingdom to take, what kind of market access it will allow for EU products.
If we had different level of tariff in different directions, would that create then a potential for smuggling across the Irish border? And in fact, there would be needs for controls on goods travelling, because there would be some financial benefits in moving goods such as beef across the border?
If I correctly understood your question, the idea would be that the United Kingdom applies across all of its borders the same tariff, but it would be a tariff that is lower than that of the European Union. In that case, as long as the United Kingdom applies its tariff on an MFN basis, and then as a matter of WTO law, there is not necessarily a problem. But of course, in terms of diversion, goods that would enter the United Kingdom under possibly a lower tariff rate from third countries would no longer, of course, enjoy now the benefit that they are then in free circulation to go to, for example, other third countries such as Ireland in case of a no-deal Brexit.
And is there already a mechanism in place whereby those goods coming from third countries could be tracked and dealt with, or would that require some time to put those systems in place? Or is that maybe not a legal question, that's a question for customs? In order to determine kind of what tariff you need to apply, whether you need to apply your MFN tariff or a preferential tariff, it is necessary, first of all, to determine the origin of the product. You need to determine from where does this product come, so that customs officials know what tariff rate to apply. And that involves preparing documentation regarding origin certificates for products. And then, of course, the products need to clear customs. And that is also a particular process, taking some time, involving documentation, clearance, etc. And so far as goods that are travelling, say, from the Republic of Ireland via Holyhead, Dover, and then into the EU, would that be is there in place some sort of facility that could happen without tariffs being collected and reclaimed and then charged again, or is there some sort of almost like free port arrangement where they can traverse, or would all that documentation have to be done at Holyhead and then again in Calais?
I mean, if the goods, of course, are intended to stay within the European Union, and if there's really no deal, then those goods will need to clear customs at that border, because that's the moment at which they're entering the European Union. It's different in case, for example, the goods might be in transit, so they're going through Ireland to another third country. There, in principle, the freedom of transit applies, so there are no import kind of checks or formalities apply. But countries may also, under the WTO, impose certain requirements where at the border they're double checking that these are indeed goods that are in transit, and that they check that these goods will not enter their domestic market. So there's a freedom of transit, but that does not preclude that a WTO member will not impose certain checks at the border, but WTO agreement says that there should be no unnecessary delays, but some checks to that extent may be possible, and that's why countries enter into certain agreements regarding transit measures so as to facilitate that process, and that it can occur as quickly as possible and with as limited cost as possible.
I don't know if Mr. Howe wants to comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I completely agree with Ms. Van Damme, but just to, I think there might be a little bit of issue of terminology. In a sense, there's no such thing as WTO mandated tariffs. What happens is each WTO member submits a schedule of tariffs, which are the so-called bound levels, and those are the maximum level of tariffs that member has committed not to charge more than that. And the European Union has submitted such a schedule. And what is happening at the WTO, and I'm sorry, I'm not quite up to date on where the process has got to, the United Kingdom is copying and pasting that schedule. So the United Kingdom, after exit, will have the same levels of upper levels of bound tariffs as the European Union currently does. But those are only upper levels. So the United Kingdom is free to levy zero tariffs if it feels like it, or some intermediate level, as long as it does it to all comers, most favoured nation basis. So the particular example of beef that you raised, where the European Union customs external tariff is very, very high, there's a policy decision to be taken. If the UK were to maintain that same level of tariffs itself and therefore impose the tariff on imports of beef from the European Union and in particular Republic of Ireland, you'd expect that would damage consumers in the UK by forcing up beef prices. If, on the other hand, you scrap the tariff altogether, then British beef farmers might feel aggrieved. So there may be a policy issue there of setting a level of tariffs that keeps the farming community on an even keel but doesn't upset consumers. But that's a policy choice for this country. Finally, on this business of goods in transit, I think it's the importance to the Republic of Ireland of its transit trade, which travels on lorries, both imports and exports, travelling via Great Britain and across channel ports onto the continent, is very high, much higher than the land border cross-border trade, and therefore, in a no-deal scenario, whatever else happens, I think it will be important to come to arrangements with the Republic of Ireland which smooth the flow of such transit traffic, because there's no point in obstructing it, and indeed in part and parcel of encouraging the European Union not to unnecessarily obstruct British lorries going through
which is why the withdrawal period
Calais.
is there, to come to these arrangements and get that.
Well, the transit, the intended transit. Yeah, well, yes, the withdrawal period.
Yeah.
But if we're assuming a no-deal exit, which I think your question was,
exit.
Mr. Goodwell, then even in no-deal exit, that means no Article 50 deal. It doesn't mean you don't necessarily have mechanistic agreements of a kind which commonly exist between trading partners, like special transit arrangements that smooth the flow of Irish goods to and from Ireland when they travel via roads in Great Britain.
Not really my area of expertise, except to point out that the cross-border beef trade from the Republic of Ireland is not unimportant to the Republic of Ireland.
So I get the impression that there can either be a situation when there's sort of, in effect, a truce, and neither side imposes these punitive tariffs, or there could be some sort of escalation of trade war where, for example, lamb exports to France had a tariff applied, and therefore the UK had no alternative but to apply similar types of tariff on other goods.
It's not an option not to apply tariffs for either party. In the absence of you could have an interim free trade agreement, for example. You could have a standstill agreement that would qualify as a free trade agreement under Article 24 of the GATT and be a permissible exception, therefore, to the most favoured nation principle. But unless you have that sort of deal, or even a temporary deal, both parties are required, I think, unless you can think of another way round, to impose whatever is their chosen level of most favoured nation tariffs on imports from the other. So the only way we could not impose any tariffs on imports from the EU would be to abolish tariffs on imports from other countries too.
So if the UK were then to apply, say, a deficiency payment scheme for sheep farmers, would that be then one of the situations that non-state aids could be challenged by the European Union that we were distorting the market?
Well,
that was mentioned earlier.
If we're in a no-deal scenario, then things like deficiency payments to farms would come under the WTO regime, would only be... I'm sorry, I'm not an expert on the WTO agriculture regime at all, but I think that there are limitations there's an agreed limit on the amount that you're allowed, if you like, to pay in direct payments to farms, but I think we're well under that. is my belief. I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in that, and you should perhaps ask someone who's more expert for a definitive answer.
Yes, it is the case under WTO law. There are clear disciplines regarding subsidies or state aid, as we call it in EU law, and then sub-disciplines regarding agriculture. And regarding domestic support, the model is that each member has accepted kind of certain levels of, maximum levels of support that they're allowed to give. As regards to MFN, indeed, it is the case that if, for example, the United Kingdom would, in a no-deal situation, apply a zero tariff to imports from the European Union, that is an advantage that is given to the European Union. And according to the MFN principle, that advantage must then unconditionally be given to also all the other WTO members. So it is not that easy to just lower the tariffs as a solution. One option that is being discussed by several people is the possibility of asking the WTO for a waiver as regards the MFN obligation. That involves a decision taken by WTO members, in principle on a consensus basis, where for a limited period of time in exceptional circumstances they would allow a waiver of the MFN obligation, and that would then be subject to, if it's for longer than a year, for annual review. So you do, that is a process that is foreseen in the WTO. It's of course one thing for the United Kingdom to ask for such a waiver to WTO members. It's a different thing for the European Union to request for such a waiver, because it would not, if the United Kingdom would request such a waiver, that would have then no effect on trade going from the United Kingdom to the European Union, because the European Union is bound by its MFN obligation. And of course for the European Union, the possibility of a waiver of that obligation would really, that border is access to an immense market, the Irish border. And there are serious concerns, of course, that the integrity of the internal market might be affected if suddenly that border is open and there are there's no tariffs, but also there's no checks as regards to technical regulations, etc. So one can understand very much the concerns of the European Union in that regard. It comes with considerable risks, that option. But it is a possibility.
So there would, in some circumstances, be incentives for people to smuggle goods across that border, which could result in a harder border than we have at the moment in terms of policing goods.
There would presumably be no objection to reducing to zero tariffs on things like olives and olive oil, which are not produced here, and therefore there'd be no threat to domestic producers. And in that way, perhaps protect against the possibility of tariffs being erected against British lamb, for example. Would that not be the case? Because, of course, that would disadvantage enormously producers in the southern parts of the European Union, since at the moment the arrangements are such that they have preferential access to UK markets, and other producers, North Africa, for example, are effectively frozen out by the tariff arrangement. That'd be a perfectly legitimate thing to do, would it not? There'd be no legal impediment, because you'd be applying under MFN rules the same zero or near zero tariff to everybody. Would that be a remedy, do you think, to the threat of punitive tariffs being raised against exports from the UK to Europe?
Well, if the MFN principle is respected, then in principle that would be possible. But if I understand correctly, the process you're describing, this is typically what happens in negotiations between trading parties, because I think what you were describing is how each party is the leverage that in such a situation each party has, and that's what parties do in trade negotiations. They use that leverage to obtain commitments, and they might obtain also certain leverage in the context of trading goods and tariffs, as part of leverage to obtain something with respect to services. And that's really kind of the essence of how many trade agreements are being negotiated, creating the type of leverage that that you've just described.
Indeed. Thank you. I'm going to move on to Jim Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming to give us your advice and thoughts and where we are. The backstop's a key issue for us and being an MP from Northern Ireland, and as a number of MPs here are. Also, the concerns run deeper than that across the whole of the chamber to many other parties who also recognise the fear and concerns of the backstop. The Attorney General has already confirmed the legally binding implications of Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. EU has been keen to tell us it's been an insurance policy and really, everything will be all right. But the fact of the matter is that if an insurance policy that I've ever had over the years, I could cancel it any time I wanted. I could actually claim any time I wanted as well. This so-called EU insurance policy isn't worth the paper it's really written on. That's my opinion. I'm not asking you to say yay or nay to that, but I'm just putting the point forward. And you mentioned, Sir Stephen, and I think you're absolutely right. Trust is at an all-time low. I wouldn't trust them to get me to that door. Never mind get me anywhere else. That's just telling you the truth. That's how I feel about them, So that's where I am, and that's why many people of my constituents also feel the same. From the very beginning, the Republic of Ireland and the EU have told us that if we don't do this, that, and the other, it'll lead to a hard border. It's marvellous how the potential or idea of a hard border is suddenly evaporated, like water in the Sahara Desert. It just goes like that there. It's like it never was there. And I sometimes wonder who's wagging it, who's a dog and who's a tail. Is it the EU wagging the Republic of Ireland tail? Is it the other way round? We all now agree. I think they accept it, that there is absolutely no need for a hard border. The implications of it, of course, are much further reaching than what the Attorney General has said, because you then go into trade negotiations. I just want to get your opinion in relation to this. My question, Mr. Chairman, in relation to the negotiations that then take place in trade. Macron, from French President, has been very clear that part of those trade negotiations and deals that will then take place within this period of time. If only Europe could work to 2 years, my goodness, it would be a miracle, so it would. They need a 10-year, a 20-year to work to make even the simplest decisions, and then screw you for every pound they can get out of you. That's my opinion of Europe, of course. But the issue very, very clearly for me is this. If we enter into trade agreement and try to achieve within 2 years, they will use the backstop and the overlap of beyond the 2 years, which then we lose our control of, and we'll hit the issue of fisheries. Now, the Prime Minister has been clear in her opinion in relation to the fisheries, but it's also clear to me that if this withdrawal agreement and the legally binding agreement and the implications of it were to take their conclusion and go beyond the 2 years, then they have the strong arm and the strong angle when it comes to enforcing trade deals, and in particular the fisheries. We want to be free of the red tape and bureaucracy of the EU when it comes to fisheries. Do you feel, collectively, individually, that to go beyond the 2 year then also makes it more difficult to get trade deals, to come to arrangements, and particularly the fisheries? And it's not only just the fisheries, it's agriculture, it's jobs as well, and there's many other implications which will go beyond that. But I'm just keen to get your thoughts upon, first of all, the importance of and do you also think that would it not be better within this withdrawal agreement to have a 2 year conclusion, a timescale on it, because that timescale will focus attention and will make sure that both parties negotiate in a way to come to a conclusion. Thank you.
I think there's several questions there. Yes.
I mean, on the issue of trust, I mean, it does seem to me on the issue of trust, the ball is in the EU's court. I mean, this is not a legal observation, it's just an observation from outside. The ball is in the EU's court because the trust is about the trust is a question about leverage. Leverage was mentioned before. Mm-hmm. Those considering the WTO exit or the government's proposed way of exiting are considering whether or not in the further negotiations that are going to take place, whatever happens, the UK will have better leverage if it's in the WTO solution than if it's in the exit withdrawal deal solution. And the history of these negotiations has been, in some ways understandably, that the EU uses their leverage very effectively. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So making sure that in the next stage the UK has the right amount of leverage and can rely on, the UK has the right amount of leverage and can rely on the EU to negotiate on a level playing field seems to me in their court to demonstrate at this point, because we can't demonstrate it.
Just make a few brief remarks. I think one thing we have to accept is that the UK market and the EU market, these are deeply integrated economies, and they probably remain so, and that's probably also economically beneficial for both parties after the deal. And when we talk about the backstop, we're dealing with specific aspects of trading goods. And that's very important, and it's especially important because it's in that context that the issue of a border mostly arises. But the integration between the UK economy, the EU economy, is not based only in trading goods. It's very much services. There's so many issues that also the European Union has an interest in obtaining access to the UK market, especially I mentioned also services, but also for fisheries. They certainly want access to UK waters. And so, but that means that the assumption that the European Union is not interested in making any agreement, in entering in an agreement with the United Kingdom soon, I find that I have a bit of difficulties with accepting that's as a starting point, because there are so many matters in which the United Kingdom and the 27 other member states now cooperate to the advantage of the respective economies, and I think the European Union has a specific interest also in those other matters regarding trade, so not only dealing with trading goods. And I think it's also the fact that ultimately traders, exporters to the UK, exporters to the European Union, they want to operate within a stable and predictable framework. And I think that's now currently the concern for many traders and exporters. And for that reason too, I think both parties have an interest in making kind of foreseeing for a comprehensive agreement, whether it's a customs union, single market trade agreement. That's a different question. But to assume, and this goes also to the issue of trust, of leverage, to assume that the European Union is not interested in a future agreement, whatever it says, I have difficulties with that as a starting point, because there are so many other issues, as the political declaration also outlines, that need to be addressed and that are of interest to both parties.
Do you think, Isabella, that do you not think then, and perhaps it's quite simple, within the withdrawal agreement that all 27 countries and the UK Prime Minister at least had put forward, that you put a 2-year time limit in that there within this term of government? Because you put 2 years on that, then that will focus attention and we will come to that conclusion. And if there is no agreement at the end of 2 years, then that's up to the EU. The element of trust keeps coming back to you. They better prove their trust to me and to the British people, because they haven't done it.
But I think one has to recognize that, taking into account that we're in a process of disintegration. We had very integrated economies, and we will now go to a model that is less integrated by definition. This is a very complex exercise, and I could understand the concern about imposing any specific time limit within which those negotiations need to be completed, because in trade negotiations in general, I think the EU's experience has been it varies depending on the particular trading partner and how ambitious the agreement is. But what you'll see once the real negotiations for the future agreement start is that you have so many different stakeholders also in those negotiations, and both will have to engage in a process of consultation with those stakeholders, and that's also of interest to the United Kingdom to know what its domestic producers, service providers want. And I think it's trade negotiators are more qualified to comment on this, but it's difficult to impose any particular, defined time limit on how long that process might take.
What's your opinion on that, Martin?
Well, on the 2-year period, I agree that it is entirely possible that negotiations with the European Union over a complex agreement could well run over that 2-year period. In addition, I've already mentioned that the government's preferred model involving this sort of dual tariff customs process, never tried anywhere in the world before. They appear to accept that it will be at least late 2021 until that can be made ready. I'm personally much more cynical. I don't think it will ever work at all. But even the government seemed to accept it can't be got ready within the 2-year transition period. And I must say I'm very concerned at a scenario where what this country needs most of all, I believe, is certainty over the future, so businesses can plan. And it seems to me that going down the withdrawal agreement route with this backstop protocol guarantees years and years of uncertainty, more negotiations going on and on and on, with the danger the backstop gets triggered because they're not finished by the end of 2020, continuing uncertainty as to future business. It makes it in practice impossible for the United Kingdom to conclude or even actually negotiate trade agreements with third parties because they don't know when we will be able to implement them. It's already, in theory, in the transition period, we have the right to negotiate them to come into force at the end of the transition period, but we'll only be able to engage trade partners if we're able to say with certainty, on the 1st of January 2021, this deal can be put into effect. So I would agree that the process has to be time limited in order. It can't be allowed to drift on, particularly with the Brexit protocol. Can I add on the subject of fisheries that you raised, because there's an important point here. The political declaration says on fisheries, within the context of the overall economic partnership, the parties should establish a new fisheries agreement on inter alia access to waters and quota shares. So there's a commitment in principle to have some sort of mutual access to waters and quota sharing agreement, although the political declaration doesn't specify the nature or shape of that. One very important point about the future relationship agreement is that it would appear from the political declaration that the intention of the government and the European Union is to negotiate it as a single agreement or linked series of agreements. Personally, I think that is a bad idea, although politically as a package it would have to be negotiated together. To link this whole lot together is a very bad idea because of future flexibility. It means that if we want to renegotiate something to do with security cooperation, we can't get out of it without bringing down the whole structure including the free trade agreement. And the Swiss found themselves in this bind, wanting to renegotiate free movement of persons, but finding that all their bilateral deals have been linked together. But the immediate problem it causes is that it means that this whole series of agreements cannot be agreed on the European Union side, except without each individual member state having a veto, because it would become a mixed competence agreement. That means every single member state can veto a deal and either push us or keep us in the backstop if its demands are not satisfied. And why this is linked to fishing is, of course, President Macron announced just after the summit where the deal was agreed that he would be using this particular lever to promote France's interests as regards access for EU boats to United Kingdom fishing waters. And one can imagine there are other concerns raised by other member states like Spain and Gibraltar, where having this lever of the individual member state being able to veto the deal with the UK will prove very problematical for us.
Okay, thank you.
I don't disagree with any of that, except to say on the question of everything being linked together, there is something in the Tusk Juncker letter that suggests that
A provisional application.
you might provisionally begin to apply things as you agreed them, but it gives no certainty about that at all.
Okay, thank you.
And it probably doesn't need saying, but I didn't answer the 2-year question.
Yeah.
I mean, 2-year time limit hasn't worked that well for us so far, but it was the only leverage we had.
Yeah.
Gregory Campbell.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome. I wanted to bring you to the issue that was raised yesterday by Mr. Shimas, I think it is, the European Commission. He raised the issue of the hard border and the potential for it if a no-deal scenario emerges by the 29th of March. I'm just wondering, because I've been endeavouring to get a political analysis of what any hard border, in inverted commas, might look like. In terms of a legal framework, what options would be open to... The UK have said they won't implement a hard border, so what options would be open in a legal framework for the EU to say, well, this is what needs to happen now? Now that we're in a no-deal scenario and we've given enough warnings that there may be a hard border, what would the range of options be open to the EU to do?
The European Union has, in principle, just as much flexibility as we do. Both would be constrained by the WTO MFN framework. So we wouldn't, for example, be able simply to say we're not going to charge any tariffs at all on goods if they happen to come over the Irish land border. We would be, but that doesn't mean that we have to enforce those tariffs by means of having, men in peak caps putting poles across the road physically at the border.
At the 300 roads?
300 roads, indeed.
And the fields and lanes and byways. Yeah.
Indeed.
This is the point I want to get to.
Indeed,
Yeah.
it's impractical.
Yeah.
As my understanding is we wouldn't be doing that. We'd just be saying we enforce tariffs, but like your VAT return, if you import goods from the Republic, you declare it on your VAT return, and you're inspected in the same way on a risk basis to make sure you've paid the tariffs. And as far as I can see, that would be compatible with the MFN principle, because we'd be charging the same tariffs. The mechanics would be different because every other border of the United Kingdom, of course, is either a seaport or an airport where goods enter, and it's only the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic.
If I could just give you a practical example that Mr. Goodwill had alluded to in terms of beef and lamb, for example. There are numerous farmlands that straddle the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So you could well have, if in a no-deal scenario, in a so-called hard border, farmers who have EU sheep and UK sheep. And it's very difficult to tell them apart in the same field. And you could have UK and EU cattle. And that's very difficult to tell apart as well, because they're both in the same field. Part of which is in the Republic, in the EU, and the rest of which is in the UK. Now, what legal framework could the EU look at and examine and implement that might resolve that conundrum?
Well, there's a further, in the WTO framework, there is a... Sorry, I'm not an expert on agricultural support, but I mean, don't they all now have to have individual ear tags?
Yes. Yeah.
So presumably the ear tags will be EU, UK ear tags.
Yeah. And they may have both.
But there's further flexibility permitted under GATT rules, which is you can have special rules and special exemptions for frontier zones. And that's permissible as a derogation from the most favoured nation principle. So very local trade, or for example, a milk round where milk's collected and taken to a local dairy could potentially come in under exemptions. So you could have a system of exemptions. What one has to be careful of in dealing with the European Union is they often assert that their rules are sort of laws of nature. Their customs code, but their customs code is amendable. They can amend it, I think, by QMV to put in special rules about the border in Northern Ireland if the political will is there to do it.
But would that have to be done in what time frame? If we were in a no-deal scenario? In the
no-deal scenario, well, they can pass legislation very quickly when they want to, is the answer. Right. I mean, normal process can take years.
But they would hardly be able to do it before the 29th of March.
I don't know about that.
Okay, just as above and down.
Some comments. I mean, as I mentioned, there's the option of asking the waiver for MFN, but I'm not sure the European Union is keen on that option. I think the example you've offered confirms again the importance of establishing origin in trade, and there are procedures, there's documentation to be complied to determine origin. But also in that particular area, it's not that type of goods. It's not only about tariffs. It's about non-tariff barriers also. And here I'm referring to technical regulations, sanitary measures that the European Union applies, and which the United Kingdom has an interest of applying also in case of a no deal. And that means that if one would want to have any, well, I'm not sure if I even want to use the term frictionless trade, because you'll always have some type of checks and fees that apply. But what you currently have is that within the European Union, the same measures apply, the same technical regulations, mostly the same sanitary measures. In case of a no deal, one might have in the beginning some alignment, but it is on a long term, it's quite likely that those regulations will start to diverge. And then you need checks to determine whether a product or even live animals, whether they are in conformity with those regulations and with those requirements. And certain of the tools through which this process is facilitated is the so-called mutual recognition agreements, which the United Kingdom is now already concluding. But most of these mutual recognition agreements, they mostly deal with the process of determining whether a product conforms with the technical regulation. There's much more...
That's right. That wouldn't necessarily have to be done at in a border setting.
Sometimes no, it doesn't have to be at border, because what you often try to achieve through these agreements is, for example, that a UK exporter and a farmer, so with an interest to export to the European Union, that you would go, for example, to a conformity assessment body, and that they could determine that the product complies with UK regulations and also with EU regulations. And that would mean that the farmer would have the exporter would have the advantage of having one certificate which enables him to then also export to the European Union. And that's one of the main objectives of these conformity assessment procedures that are determined in mutual recognition agreements. But I should note that the European Union has already certain types of those agreements, and I understand that UK is trying to model those agreements, but you have many different types of those agreements, so they don't all provide for the situation that you get the single certificate. So that's something to be negotiated. Also, then of course with the European Union, and then you have, the parties need to agree on the criteria for these processes. If you do not have such an agreement, the WTO rules talk a little bit about mutual recognition, but the obligations can be interpreted in different ways, and the reason why you have mutual recognition agreements is often because there is no absolute guarantee under WTO law that the other party will recognize your equivalent regulations. So as regards to technical regulations, for example, the TBT agreement says that each WTO member will give positive consideration to the possibility of mutual recognition of another party's technical regulations in case they are deemed to fulfill the objectives of its own regulations. When it's about the conformity assessment procedures, it provides that one will recognize the results of such procedures of another WTO member, but provided that there is an equivalence of assurance that the product complies with the technical regulations. So there are certain obligations in WTO law, but they don't give absolute assurances, and that's why countries try to have these mutual recognition agreements. I should note that what's happening now, of course, that if you have a comprehensive trade agreement, that of course mutual recognition is negotiated in the context of those trade agreements. So if you look at the agreements that the EU has concluded with Japan, with Canada, you have all different forms of arrangements regarding recognition in those treaties, depending also on the type of product concerned. So it's often depending on groups of products. So pharmaceuticals might be different from electronic equipment, for example.
Okay. I've not much to say on this, but I'm maybe taking a simplistic view, but I don't see how non-tariff barriers create much of a problem initially, because, as has been said, there will be alignment. And I should have thought in a no-deal scenario it would be relatively easy, or ought to be relatively easy, to come to an agreement quickly that neither side would make changes to their regulatory regimes that would have an impact on the Irish border.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah. Thank you, Chair.
Lady Hammond.
Thank you so much. I was just checking on what was reported to have been said, and I think it is accurate, by the European Commission yesterday. In fact, if there is no deal, it is obvious, to quote, I think, the gentleman who was speaking, that there will be a hard border. Do you think he got it absolutely wrong?
Well, I think the detail has been discussed by the other members of the panel.
Well, Sir Stephen, I have to say that, in fact, in your introduction, you indicated your extensive career that went right back to the very difficult days of Northern Ireland. So I would really like to hear from you on this particular issue.
It does seem to me that in a no-deal scenario, there is considerable freedom. There are constraints, but there is considerable freedom for the UK to produce a situation in which there doesn't need to be a border, any change to the border arrangements on our side. So,
sorry to interrupt, but I actually think when I heard the arguments about the Leave campaign in 2016, that one of the key mantras was taking back control of our money, sovereignty and our borders. So in the event, heaven forbid, that we have a no deal, how are we taking back control? How are we taking back control of the border in, for example, Cross Midland or South Armagh?
Well, I'm not suggesting either of this. I'm not advocating any of this. What I'm saying is that it seems to me that from a technical point of view, there is considerable freedom for the UK to ensure that the border arrangements on our side remain the same. So that the pressure then comes on how responsible we are for whatever the Irish Republic has to do because the EU forced them to. That's the question. I think it's a political question what we're prepared to accept in that way.
So was the EU Commission wrong to say it was obvious that there is going to be a hard border on the island of Ireland if there was no deal?
Well, if that's an expression of a determination to ensure that the Irish Republic erects one, then I suppose it is correct, yes.
So, I mean, it's very hard to comment on that without reasons. I mean, as I've said, the European Union, I mean, we are free not to create a hard border within the WTO framework.
So we don't take back control of the border?
No. I think that's a different issue. We are entitled to, I mean, for example, after we leave, the point is we will be free to have laws that depart from European Union laws, including laws on, for example, and quite an important example, improved scientific breeding methods, which EU law at the moment is very, very unscientifically restrictive of. And it may well be, if we adopt a more liberal framework, that we would then have farmers in the United Kingdom, including farmers in Northern Ireland, having the ability to use improved breeds of crops or animals.
Yes.
Now, at that point, issues would arise because the European Union would say, oh, we don't want a cow that doesn't conform with our anti-GMO laws to cross the border into the Republic. But the fact you have differing regulations on both sides of the border doesn't mean that you have to enforce rules against the movement of goods by means that are on the border.
Well,
You can stop such things entering the commercial chain.
you can stop such things, right. Have you visited the border at the present time on the island of Ireland?
I haven't visited the border, no.
No, you haven't?
No.
Right.
My most recent visit was to Belfast.
Right. Well, let's approach this in from a different direction then. Let's ask whether in fact the Prime Minister, I mean the backstop is already in the withdrawal deal. It's in the Brexit deal. The Prime Minister has signed it. The 27 other EU member states have signed it. Are you telling the committee that the Prime Minister was wrong to sign that deal with a backstop arrangement to protect peace and the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement?
Well, that's a highly political question, and obviously it's a very, very highly political question, and I'm primarily here to talk about the law, although I've informed you of my political views of leaving.
Yes.
So in a sense, I'm in the committee's hands on how I answer it. I mean, I can give a political answer, but is that appropriate for me?
You are here primarily as part of a panel of lawyers, so I
Yes,
think it would be reasonable for you to decline to answer as a politician.
I mean, that is a very broad political question. Was it right to sign it or not? I mean, my personal opinion is no, but that's not a... I think that's not appropriate as part of my evidence as a lawyer.
That's very clear.
But what I can point to is the consequences of this protocol are that the way it locks us in, as I've described, are very adverse.
Yes.
And the other side of the equation, if you analyse it, is actually this mechanism, a necessary mechanism, if you want to ensure a continued open border with no infrastructure on the border, to which the answer is there are other mechanisms other than alignment of regulations, namely enforcing border controls, but my mechanisms which operate away from the border.
Yes. Well, going back then to the reason that you're here as a team of lawyers, let us just look at what the Attorney General said on the 3rd of December at the dispatch box in the House. He described the backstop as much an instrument of pain for the European Union as it was for the UK.
Again, well,
I'm sure you're familiar with
yeah,
that expression.
I am familiar with that. Well, if it is an instrument of pain, it is a pain that the European Union has suffered for something like 30 years in the case of the EU-Turkey agreement, a very similar customs union arrangement where Turkey, as the junior partner, has to follow EU common external tariff.
Well, of course, it's not, forgive me for interrupting and disagreeing with you, but it's not the equivalent of the arrangement with Turkey. This is a different scenario completely, where a member state, the UK, will be leaving the EU. A member state will be leaving under Article 50. So we only get into the backstop arrangement if we get through the transition period. When we get through the transition period, and if there isn't an agreement at that stage, that's the only time that the backstop becomes operational, yes? But at that stage, a member state has to leave the EU, an entire member state, not part of a member state, the entire member state. So surely to goodness, the backstop arrangement is at that stage challengeable in court, because the whole of the member state, the UK, must leave. So it's already potentially challengeable. Is that not correct?
Well, that's a different question, Lady Herman. Which
yes,
is,
well, it is an instrument of pain for the EU, because they won't want to be in that sort of arrangement any time.
The instrument of pain for the EU, we're considering what happens if the protocol comes into force. And if the protocol comes into force, a sector of European Union law will continue to apply within Northern Ireland, but not to Great Britain. And it will continue to apply to Northern Ireland very much in the same way as it applies within a member state. In other words, under the enforcement control of the European Commission, under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. The only difference between Northern Ireland and a member state, in effect, will be Northern Ireland will not have any means of voting on those laws, whether via the Northern Ireland Assembly or via the Westminster Parliament. As regards Great Britain, the arrangement will involve an external customs union with the European Union, modelled on the Turkey arrangement. The status of Northern Ireland will be that it will be inside the European Union's customs union. Great Britain will be outside the customs union, but in union with that. And that's an important point, because that implies that there will be customs declarations and checks on goods which travel from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. There will be customs checks between Great Britain on the one side and the European Union and Northern Ireland together. The effect of the customs union provisions will be that there will be zero tariffs on goods that cross that border, but they will still have to follow customs formalities. And what is said, or what Mr. Cox suggested, is that this would be a painful scenario for the European Union. Now, I have difficulty in understanding why it's a painful scenario for the European Union. At the moment, the goods trade between the United Kingdom and the EU, we have a massive deficit in that trade. It's about £95 billion per annum, I think, on the latest figures. It's therefore very much in the interest of the European Union to have the United Kingdom in a customs union with them. That not only means they have tariff-free access into our market for their goods, but it also maintains the external tariff wall, the European Union external tariff wall, out around the boundaries of the United Kingdom, thereby protecting the high tariff areas, particularly on motor vehicles and agricultural products. So it then protects continental producers against imports from the rest of the world, which potentially would be at lower prices if we control our own, if we were to control our own tariff policy, or if we were to be able to do independent free trade deals, which we would not be able to do
Well,
So I
sorry.
find it very difficult to understand why this should be a painful situation for the
Well,
European
let
Union.
me put it to you that, in fact, it would be a painful situation because, in fact, you've just argued that it would be difficult for the UK to enter into trade deals because of the particular arrangements for Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. Let me put it to you that, in fact, it would be equally difficult for the European Union to enter into any trade deals because in entering into a trade deal, you would have to be specific, the EU would have to be specific about the territory to which that trade deal would extend, and the complication would be. So it is just. Sorry, could I just ask Ms. Van Dam if, in fact, if she would take that point, that in fact it would be equally difficult for the EU to enter into trade deals if, in fact, we had this particular arrangement in operation in Northern Ireland.
Perhaps to some extent, but I think when talking about this pain for the EU, I mostly consider that point from the perspective of the fact that the single market is always supposed to be indivisible in terms of the four freedoms.
Absolutely.
And that was the starting point of the negotiations for the European Union, and the European Union's main interest is in maintaining that integrity. And as I understand it, by negotiating this backstop, the European Union did make a concession because it allows free movement of goods with a particular territory that will be part of a third country. So it has accepted some degree of division in these very exceptional circumstances.
Yes.
And I think that was probably a considerable concession for the European Union to make, and the European Union might be concerned that this sets a precedent also
exactly.
For the future. So
Exactly.
the EU always tries to maintain the integrity of its internal market, and that comes with those four freedoms. And now it's made the concession as regards to Northern Ireland with respect to free movement of goods, and that's rather exceptional.
So you're confirming that, in fact, this is not something that is attractive to the EU if we were ever to get into the backstop arrangement?
I don't think it was an easy concession to make, but I think it was a trade-off that the EU accepted as part of a solution for avoiding a so-called hard border.
Thank you. Now
How many trade deals are the EU likely to be negotiating in the next? It takes them so long anyway. In the next 10 years, the whole thing would be. I mean, Lady Herman's point. Can you answer that?
Yes, can I answer that? Because Lady Herman suggested that the existence of the backstop arrangements, if they come into force, would be an obstacle to the European Union in concluding trade deals with third countries. I don't believe that is the case. Very similar arrangements with Turkey have not proved an obstacle to the European Union. And the problem, from our point of view, is that if the European Union were to do a trade agreement with a new country, let's say India, just take a random example, and they were to agree, therefore, to put zero tariffs on most or all Indian goods, we would be obliged, under the backstop arrangement, to give the same tariff concession to India, but we would not be entitled to benefit from the reciprocal benefits of the trade agreement. This is a very serious problem that Turkey has encountered, where the European Union has entered into new trade agreements, that Turkey has to give the tariff concessions to align with the common external tariff of the European Union for goods into its own market. But it has no guarantee of getting reciprocal concessions from the other country.
Well, we're concentrated on the backstop. We only ever get into the backstop if, at the end of the transition period, 31st of December 2020, that in fact we haven't actually completed our new trading arrangements with the EU. So we only get into the backstop if we get into the transition period, and we only get into the transition period if we have a deal. And we have to have a deal by the 29th of March of this year. So how do we solve the impasse? Some people call it a crisis, but how do we solve that impasse at the present time? because the arguments about the backstop could be completely academic if we don't have a deal by the 29th of March. That is set in statute. So how do we get there? How do we break this logjam? So, Steve.
Well, I think there can only be a political solution, and as I said before, the political solution is to find something, and it seems to me it's likely to have to come from the EU, that will give people trust that the withdrawal agreement and the framework for the future relationship can result in a satisfactory outcome for the United Kingdom. And essentially, I think that means, because in the end it's going to depend on what's in the agreement for the future relationship, I think from a UK point of view, that means giving reassurance that we are not surrendering our leverage in the negotiation, what comes next, at too great a cost if we enter the withdrawal agreement. That's the question. I think that it's a political answer, and I'm not a politician, and I don't want to give a political answer. I've spent my life aligning my view with the government. It's hard habit to break, and I wouldn't trust myself to say anything else.
Right. Ms. Van Dam.
I do think that, as was just said, it's essential to focus on the future relationship, and at least to decide, whether a customs union might be acceptable, whether it's going to be a trade agreement, whether a single market, because let's assume that very early on one agrees on negotiating a customs union of some sort, then maybe the backstop as a transition to that might be less problematic. Of course, if the objective is not to have a customs union, the backstop does become, for certain people, more problematic. So more clarity on at least the model of the basic architecture of the future trading relationship is essential also to start negotiating on how to replace the backstop, because as if the agreement enters into force, one immediately starts negotiating also on a possible alternative to which the protocol refers, on replacing it. But in those negotiations on replacing the backstop with a better solution, because this is a protocol, that is will be in continuing negotiation, let's say, that's foreseen in the agreement itself. It does seem essential that the parties to that negotiation have some basic common understanding of what the model is. And although the agreement seems to refer to some kind of common customs territory, as I understand it, at least in the United Kingdom, there is no consensus yet on what that model would be that is acceptable to the United Kingdom. So clarity on that seems to be an essential condition on then starting the negotiations for replacing this particular protocol.
And in the event that we don't have a deal by the 29th of March, as I say, I hope that is not the case, but in that event, how would the Republic of Ireland be expected to protect the integrity of the single market?
Well, I think the government, Northern Ireland, continues to support the agreement and hopes that the agreement will enter into force. But it will be difficult for Ireland to unilaterally take particular action as regards specifically the trade aspect, because there's many aspects to this particular border. Because we're dealing here with aspects that have to do with the European Union's common commercial policy.
Yes.
And that is an exclusive competence of the European Union. Now one can see maybe the European Union delegating some of those powers, but I think that would be very difficult. So I think Ireland will be bound by its obligations under the EU
to protect
treaties, and that will be difficult to reconcile with its interest not to have a hard border.
Thank you.
Ian Paisley, then we'll come to Mary Caulfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for your evidence. It's been very, very helpful and very clear. Could I go to you first of all, Isabella, with regards to the WTO issues that you've spoken about already. Let's cast our minds forward to the 30th of March this year. Unfortunately, there hasn't been an agreement worked out. Time has run out. On day one of a no-deal scenario, what happens with goods that are travelling across Northern Ireland to the Republic of Ireland? Anything? Anything different?
First of all, so assuming that there is no waiver of any type of WTO obligations, assuming that the parties both apply at both sides of the borders, respect their MFN obligations, then in principle tariffs would be imposed according to the applied rates of each party.
That would happen on the 30th?
In principle, yes, because if the United Kingdom is no longer a party, a member of the European Union, then it's a third country, and then also WTO law does not require such any WTO member to impose its tariffs. It can apply no tariffs on an MFN basis, but at least the Irish side, Ireland has obligations, as a matter of EU law, to apply the Common Customs Code.
And the waiver that you mentioned, the
MFN.
Yes, MFN waiver, that would effectively act as a transition period if it came in during that time, would it?
It could. I mean, MFN waiver is by definition a waiver in WTO law has a temporal limitation on it. Yeah. That would need to be agreed in the WTO what the limitation is.
And that could be agreed ex post facto?
No, in principle it's in advance.
Of the 30th?
Yeah, and of course one would need to see how WTO members, respond to this proposal and the timing of when it is raised. But it would be, in principle, a decision that needs to be taken in the WTO on a consensus basis.
And would you be urging governments to be engaging in that conversation now?
I don't think
as an insurance policy.
I think well, it would be a question for this to work. You would need to have the United Kingdom and the European Union both asking for a waiver as regards to their MFN obligations, and I don't know if they're testing the waters in Geneva, but third countries, I don't think are currently thinking of this. The initiative lies entirely with the WTO member who would be seeking the specific waiver. And I don't. There's even if the United Kingdom would ask for a waiver, there's no guarantee that the European Union will do the same unless they come to an agreement. But I think that's with many of these issues, the problem is that even for to find alternative solutions in case there is no deal, and to then find ways to facilitate trade under WTO terms, agreements need to be made. For example, just the mutual recognition agreements, the parties do need to come together, and that goes to the issue of trust again that Sir Stephen...
On that issue then, Sir Stephen, you mentioned the issue of the Juncker and Tusk correspondence that has been going backwards and forwards between Her Majesty's government and the EU. You accept the Attorney General's interpretation of those letters that they have no legal standing, isn't that right? They don't change this withdrawal agreement.
They don't change it. No, they are, as they purport to be, part of the workings towards the treaty that would be taken into account in international law in construing it. But on the other hand, there are only very limited respects in which they add to the terms of the proposed agreement itself.
Thank you. Martin, Paul Bew, Lord Bew, yesterday gave a presentation in Parliament that the withdrawal agreement as it is currently constituted drives a coach and horses through the Belfast Agreement. And he said that really the Irish government had let down its obligations in defending the Belfast Agreement because they were more interested in the backstop arrangements. And he added meat to that suggestion by saying that under the withdrawal agreement, a new institution is effectively put in place which takes on part of the responsibilities that the Northern Ireland Assembly should actually be doing. And therefore, this withdrawal agreement actually breaches the Belfast Agreement, or the Good Friday Agreement, as it is sometimes called. Do you agree with that analysis?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't. I didn't see that, or so I'm not aware of what Lord Bew said in his presentation, I'm afraid. I mean, so I can't comment on the particular points he put forward. But on the broader question of does the backstop protocol alter the constitutional status of Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, I would say yes, it does. And I, this has been slightly historical, looking back to the Articles of Union of 1800. Interestingly, one particular Article of Union said that His Majesty's subjects in Ireland shall be entitled to the same privileges under all foreign treaties as His Majesty's subjects in Great Britain. And I think technically that is still part of statute law in Northern Ireland.
Forgive me, Mr. Hall, I just have to correct that. We did have the Belfast Agreement was implemented by the Northern Ireland Act of 1998,
yes,
which makes it quite clear the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is that it remains part of the United Kingdom unless and until the people of Northern Ireland voting in a border poll express a wish that that should be changed. So the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is set out by the Northern Ireland Act of 1998, not by the older legislation that you just referred to. To suggest that that still binds is not correct.
Lady Herman, it's part of statute law. Therefore, it can be amended by an Act of Parliament.
Yes.
So Parliament could enact an Act that implements the withdrawal agreement, and that would have an effect of overriding that provision.
Yes.
But in my view, that still results in the alteration of the constitutional status of Northern Ireland.
Sorry, forgive me.
Because
the constitutional status was set out in the Northern Ireland Act as which implemented the Belfast Agreement. On page 307 of the withdrawal deal, which has been signed, the Belfast Agreement and the consent principle and the constitutional status of Northern Ireland are guaranteed in black and white in the Brexit deal, which has been signed by all EU members and the UK government. So it is deeply unhelpful, I think, to suggest that the Brexit deal has undermined the constitutional status of Northern Ireland.
I want to take this point myself. It's one that I've been waiting for all day, and I'd like to continue to actually take it. I actually think it does damage the Belfast Agreement. I'm surprised that those people who are cheerleaders for the Belfast Agreement have allowed something else, because of whatever their political machinations are, to overtake it and subsume it, and not to actually defend their agreement and the agreement, which is so precious in every other set of circumstances, but in this second set of circumstances can damage the Belfast Agreement because it suits them politically. Page 327 of the withdrawal agreement, I think you referred to it, Article 18, I believe. It contains the words that economic, societal and environmental difficulties that might arise, the European Union can unilaterally interfere in those matters and direct actions unilaterally. That obviously, if that became law, would change the Belfast Agreement, because the European Union could act unilaterally on any economic, societal or environmental difficulty that might arise during the period of the backstop. Am I right?
The effect of the safeguard measures, as I said earlier, I think that the type of measure this is contemplating would be something like the European Union imposing special duties in the event it felt that actions were being taken by the United Kingdom, whether in Great Britain or Northern Ireland, which cause either serious economic, societal and environmental difficulties or diversion of trade.
Well, it says that if the application of the protocol leads to a serious economic, societal or environmental difficulty liable to persist or to the diversion of trade, the Union, the EU, may, and of course the UK, may unilaterally take appropriate
Yes.
measures. Now, given that the United Kingdom is paying for Northern Ireland through its taxes and all the rest, and through subvention and everything else, none of that changes. But unilaterally, the EU can take actions in Northern Ireland. That changes Northern Ireland's rights and privileges as a UK citizen, as a UK part of the United Kingdom. And I don't know if you've thought about what some of those economic, societal or environmental difficulties might actually be. So, for example, if there was a lack of products which came in to Northern Ireland as a result of our treating GB as a third country, that could cause us difficulties. That could cause environmental or social problems, or economic problems. The EU would have the right to act if it so desired, unilaterally.
Yes, I don't read this, though, as entitling the European Union to, as it were, take action inside Northern Ireland or impose measures inside Northern Ireland. I would have thought that's a stretch to read it that way. Where in my view, the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is affected is primarily by the making it required to be part of Northern Ireland law, the large number of measures which are set out in Annex 5 of the agreement, which is, the titles of these measures run to about 70 pages, and they're European measures relating to, they centre around those relating standards for goods, but they do go wider.
These would be laws that would affect Northern Ireland directly.
They would directly
And
apply.
the Northern Ireland Assembly, if it was functioning, would have no role in formulating these laws, other than overseeing.
No, it would be the same relationship as we now have as a member state. So where there are regulations, they would be directly applicable. They'd just be law without any intervening action. Where they are directives, it would be the same in principle as now, but within Northern Ireland. The United Kingdom would be obliged to implement them, but there would have to be transposing measures. Whether those transposing measures were taken by Parliament at Westminster or by the Northern Ireland Assembly is an internal constitutional matter for us. But we would have no, and in fact, as you're aware, the Assembly does have existing powers under the European Communities Act 1972 to transpose directives within the scope of its own powers. So effectively that system would carry on. But the point is those directives leave very little room for manoeuvre, and they would be, their enforcement would be supervised by the European Commission, again very much the same as now as a member state, and they would be justiciable by the Court of Justice in Luxembourg by references, direct references from the courts of Northern Ireland.
Northern Ireland would be treated completely different from the rest of GB
Indeed.
in all of these matters.
Indeed, in Great Britain, that regime would not
That
apply.
would be permanent, or as you say, locked in.
Well, indefinite is probably the best word rather than permanent, but indefinite if until an agreement were reached to leave the.
And that would certainly be seen as a constitutional change in Northern Ireland, linked with the rest of the UK.
Well, having a significant segment of your laws which are outside your control, no say over, and when that regime does not apply to the rest of the United Kingdom, strikes me as a constitutional difference.
Going back to my earlier point, under the Belfast Agreement, the whole trick in that was to give the people a say in their laws and their regulations. That is actually removed from them, because the Assembly would really have no say in this. They would just have to put it in place.
The Assembly would have, in effect, the same limited degree of discretion where it comes to directives. Where it comes to directives on the details of how they're implemented, as the Westminster Parliament now does as an EU member state.
There is damage done to the principles of the Belfast Agreement. if we pursued the withdrawal agreement as it currently stands?
Well, I personally would characterise it as a constitutional change. I mean, it's not as radical as moving the whole of Northern Ireland completely outside the United Kingdom, but it is still significant.
Apart, and that's been the problem with Northern Ireland. When it's been treated as a place apart, it then has acted as a place apart. When it's treated as a place within the United Kingdom, it acts better. Treating it as a place apart causes the problems.
I think that's more an observation from you than a question for me to answer.
In terms of in terms of technological solutions for the border arrangements, there's been some change. Initially, it was said that really there weren't technological solutions, and there appears now to be a few from the government that there are, and that measures can be taken. Would you be surprised if the government hasn't spent any money on trying to attract contractors or looking at programmes that would allow the application of those technological measures?
Well, I am disappointed by that because, indeed, in fact, in a way, in response to Lady Herman's question of how one could get out, how one could solve the backstop problem, I think a large part of the difficulty, not all of the difficulty, because the difficulty arises from the European Union's wanting to impose it. But a large part of the difficulty in dealing with the backstop issue has been that the British government has been effectively saying that we want to maintain a completely open and uncontrolled border. And actually they want that, not just the Northern Ireland land border, but also the sea border. And the problem with doing that is that if you say to the European Union, we want a completely uncontrolled border, the European Union naturally say, well, what other measures are there to protect the single market from either goods which don't bear European Union tariffs migrating inwards, or goods which don't comply with European Union regulatory laws migrating inwards. And if you rule out any form of control of goods crossing the border, you necessarily go down this road of having effectively insoluble conflicts and problems, of either having Northern Ireland having a different regime from Great Britain, or the whole of the United Kingdom being locked in to following European Union rules and laws while having no vote on them. And the alternative is indeed to propose measures which control the flow of goods across the border, but without infrastructure on the border. And that is mentioned in the political declaration, but it seems to us it's a late addition. In fact, that's paragraph 27, which refers to such facilitative arrangements and technologies will also be considered in developing any alternative arrangements ensuring the absence of a hard border on the island of Ireland on a permanent footing. So it's in there as a possibility.
But you think if it's there as a political declaration, it would be remiss of the government not to actually start spending money looking for those solutions?
If they're serious, and of course the other problem with it as it's phrased is that it simply says that they will be considered. So the European Union has accepted an obligation, if you like, to consider the arrangements in good faith. But of course they can easily say, well, we're not happy with them. We don't think they're watertight enough, so we're not going to agree them. And it seems to me an essential way of getting out of the conundrum of the backstop is actually for the UK to have a right to control, as it were, to control the border with a scheme of away from the border controls.
Of course, if you can alter the Belfast Agreement in one way, as we've discussed earlier, you could alter it in another way by technological solutions on the border, which previously were not there.
Well, forgive me.
People have always said that any change to the border is a change to the totem that is the Belfast Agreement.
Yes,
of course we can change it in one aspect of this, as we've already discussed. There'd be no problem.
Well, I mean, as far as I'm aware, the Belfast Agreement doesn't expressly deal with the border, So one's talking here about, if you like, a political interpretation of it, which you're more qualified to talk about than I am.
So, Stephen, did you want to come in on that?
Well, I did want to say something about the Belfast Agreement, and which of course binds both the United Kingdom and the Republic, and in the situation where we had no deal and the Republic was being asked to erect a border by the European Union, they would be concerned about whether that affected their obligations, then that might affect the attitude of the EU to whether or not they seek a waiver. But the Belfast Agreement and the backstop are entwined, because to some extent the backstop is supposed to repeat the obligations of the Good Friday Agreement. To some extent it's supposed to implement them. I mean, as a drafter of legislation, I don't think repeating obligations is ever a very good idea, because all you ever do is create a hole for people to show some incompatibility with them. But there are respects in which something is needed to implement it in the context of our not being in the EU. And I know that there are arguments. I had heard Lord Buse.
The judgment not say that there was no, that actually Brexit did not affect, did not have an impact, a negative impact on the implementation of the Belfast Agreement as it currently stands.
I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
You said you did hear Paul Buse.
Sorry?
You said you did hear Paul Buse's comments?
Well, I heard a summary of them, yes. And there are arguments, and we've heard some, that there might be some incompatibility between the Belfast Agreement and the withdrawal deal. And I'm not sure whether I agree with them, but I don't think they're outlandish. And I think they become stronger if the